Mystery on the Aurora Express. A long whistle pierced the silence of the night. The luxurious Aurora Express was preparing to leave Grand Victoria Station, bound for the city of Eldoria. The passengers, nobles, businessmen, and enigmatic figures had already settled into their compartments. In the main carriage, Detective Alaric Graves sat reading a newspaper. Dressed in a black suit with piercing eyes, he was not merely on vacation. He was hunting a high-profile fugitive rumored to be on this train. But he had no idea that tonight, there wouldn't just be a fugitive among them, but also a murderer. Suddenly, the clinking of glasses echoed from the dining car. A woman in a red dress, Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a well-known socialite, was sipping champagne while conversing with an elderly man, Lord Montgomery Ashford, a collector of rare antiques. In the corner of the room, a young man with a tense expression, Nathaniel Cross, looked anxious, repeatedly glancing out the window as if trying to avoid someone. The train's lights flickered momentarily as it crossed an old bridge. The sound of metal wheels grinding against the rails filled the quiet night. Then, a piercing scream came from carriage number 6. The passengers exchanged nervous glances. Detective Graves immediately stood up and rushed toward the source of the noise. Some passengers peeked out from their compartments, trying to see what had happened. When Graves pushed open the door to the carriage, he found Lord Montgomery Ashford's lifeless body sprawled on the floor of his cabin. His eyes were wide open, as if he had seen something shocking before his death. Embedded in his chest was a small dagger engraved with the Whitmore family crest. The train continued to race through the darkness of the night. The murderer was among them, and no one could escape. The air inside carriage number 6 was thick with tension. The passengers gathered outside, whispering in hushed voices. The luxurious interior of the train was now tainted by the gruesome sight of Lord Montgomery Ashford's lifeless body. Detective Alaric Graves knelt beside the corpse, carefully examining the dagger lodged in the old man's chest. The silver blade gleamed under the dim cabin light, its hilt intricately engraved with the Whitmore family crest. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, standing just outside the doorway, let out a sharp gasp. That dagger belongs to my family," she stammered. Graves turned his sharp gaze toward her. "Can you explain why your family's weapon was used in a murder?" Eleanor took a step back, her fingers trembling. "I don't know. I swear I've never seen that dagger before." The detective rose to his feet and looked around the cabin. There were no signs of forced entry. The window was locked from the inside, and the door could only be opened with a key. Lord Ashford had been murdered in a locked room. Nathaniel Cross, the nervous young man from the dining car, pushed his way to the front. "This is insane. The train hasn't stopped since we left the station. That means the killer is still here." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Exactly. The murderer is among us." From behind the crowd, the train conductor, Mr. Hargrove, stepped forward. His face was pale. "Detective, what should we do? We're still hours away from Eldoria." Graves took a deep breath and turned to the passengers. "No one leaves this train until we find the killer. Everyone will be questioned." As the train continued its relentless journey through the dark wilderness, the tension inside the carriages grew. Somewhere among them, the murderer was hiding, and Graves knew this was only the beginning. The luxurious Aurora Express thundered through the dark countryside, but inside, time felt frozen. The passengers were now gathered in the smoking lounge, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and suspicion. Detective Alaric Graves stood at the center of the room, his piercing gaze scanning each individual. "No one leaves this train until I uncover the truth," he declared. "And that starts with questioning each of you." Suspect number 1. Lady Eleanor Whitmore Graves turned to Lady Eleanor, the woman whose family crest was found on the murder weapon. She sat on an emerald green velvet chair, her hands clenched tightly together. "Lady Eleanor, let's start with you," Graves said, his voice calm but firm. "What was your relationship with Lord Montgomery Ashford?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I barely knew him," she insisted. "We spoke briefly over dinner, but that's all. I have no reason to harm him." Graves leaned forward. "And yet, a dagger bearing your family's crest was found in his chest. Care to explain?" Eleanor's face paled. I have no idea how that dagger got there. My family has many heirlooms. It could have been stolen." Graves studied her carefully. She was either telling the truth or a very skilled liar. Suspect number 2, Nathaniel Cross. Next, Graves turned to Nathaniel Cross, the anxious young man who had been acting strangely since the journey began. "Nathaniel, why did you seem so nervous earlier in the dining car?" Nathaniel hesitated before answering. "I wasn't nervous. I was just uneasy." "Uneasy about what?" Graves pressed. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. "Fine. I saw someone sneaking into Lord Ashford's cabin just before the murder." The room fell silent. "Who?" Graves demanded. Nathaniel hesitated, then pointed a shaking finger, straight at the train conductor, Mr. Hargrove. The tension in the room thickened. The passengers turned their gazes toward Mr. Hargrove, who stood frozen near the doorway. His usually composed expression had twisted into one of shock. "This is absurd," the conductor sputtered. "Why would I have anything to do with this?" Nathaniel's voice wavered. "I swear I saw you. You were near his cabin just before the scream." Graves narrowed his eyes. Had they just found their prime suspect? Or was someone trying to frame the conductor? Outside, the train rattled over a bridge, its whistle echoing through the night. The murderer was still among them, and Graves knew the real game had just begun. A heavy silence filled the smoking lounge as all eyes locked on to Mr. Hargrove, the train conductor. Accused by Nathaniel Cross, he stood stiff, his hands gripping the brim of his cap. "I had nothing to do with Lord Ashford's murder," Hargrove protested. "Yes, I was near his cabin, but I wasn't the only one." Detective Alaric Graves folded his arms. "Who else was there?" Hargrove hesitated. "I saw someone lurking in the hallway before the scream. Someone in a dark coat, but I couldn't see their face." Graves tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair. The description was too vague. But one thing was clear: the killer was not acting alone. A surprising discovery. Graves motioned to Officer Reynolds, a security officer traveling aboard the train. "Reynolds, search Hargrove's quarters." Reynolds nodded and disappeared down the corridor. Moments later, he returned, carrying a small, blood-stained handkerchief. The initials embroidered on it read, E.W. All heads turned toward Lady Eleanor Whitmore. She gasped. "That's mine, but I didn't leave it there, I swear." Graves studied her reaction. Fear, genuine shock, or the panic of a murderer caught too soon. "Say the meat seemed how much irritating rustin." Another revelation. Reynolds stepped forward again. "Detective, there's something else. Lord Ashford's cabin key. It's missing." Graves frowned. "So the killer didn't break in. They had the key." His mind raced. Only a few people could have accessed it. The train staff, or someone close enough to Ashford to have stolen it. Glancing at the passengers, Graves knew the pieces were starting to come together. But there was still one thing missing: the motive. Outside, the train rattled through the dark wilderness. The murderer was growing desperate, and Graves had the unsettling feeling that they weren't done killing yet. The Aurora Express cut through the dark wilderness, its whistle piercing the night. But inside, the passengers were trapped in a deadly game of deception. Detective Alaric Graves examined the blood-stained handkerchief embroidered with Lady Eleanor's initials. The missing key to Lord Ashford's cabin only deepened the mystery. But before he could draw a conclusion, "Help! Someone help!" a desperate scream echoed down the corridor. The passengers jumped in alarm. Graves bolted toward the sound, his coat billowing behind him. Bursting into carriage number 4, he found Nathaniel Cross standing over a slumped figure. Mr. Hargrove, the train conductor, was dead. His throat had been slashed. A pool of blood spread across the floor. His train whistle, clutched tightly in his lifeless hand, let out a faint, eerie wheeze. A race against time. The passengers crowded at the doorway, gasping at the sight. Lady Eleanor Whitmore turned pale. "Dear God, the killer is still among us," she whispered. Graves clenched his fists. The murderer had struck again, this time eliminating a key witness. He turned to Nathaniel, who was still shaking. "How did you find him?" Nathaniel stammered. I was heading to my cabin when I heard a struggle. When I got here, he was already dead." Graves narrowed his eyes. Was Nathaniel truly innocent, or was he playing a dangerous game? Clue. Kren. Graves noticed something near Mr. Hargrove's body. A gold cufflink lay on the floor, smeared with blood. He picked it up and turned to the passengers. "Does this belong to anyone?" A deadly silence followed. Then, a single hand clenched into a fist. Lord Ashford had been killed with a dagger. Mr. Hargrove had been silenced before revealing too much. The killer was becoming reckless, and Graves knew the next victim might be him. The Aurora Express rumbled through the dark, but inside, tensions burned like fire. Detective Alaric Graves stood in the center of the smoking lounge, turning the blood-smeared gold cufflink over in his fingers. "Someone on this train owns this," he said, his voice slicing through the silence. "And it may just belong to our killer." The passengers shifted uncomfortably. Then Sir Reginald Whitmore, a distinguished nobleman in his 60s, cleared his throat. "That cufflink is mine." Gasps rippled through the room. Graves stepped closer. "Care to explain how it ended up next to Mr. Hargrove's murdered body?" Reginald's jaw tightened. I lost it earlier this evening. Someone must have taken it." Lady Eleanor Whitmore, his niece, looked horrified. "Uncle, are you saying someone is trying to frame you?" Reginald nodded gravely. "I had nothing to do with this. I swear Graves studied him. Was he telling the truth? Or was this the desperate plea of a guilty man? A dangerous confession." Just as Graves was about to press further, a shaky voice interrupted. Nathaniel Cross. "Detective, I have something to confess." All eyes turned to him. Nathaniel's hands trembled. "I lied earlier. I did see the killer." A hush fell over the room. Graves stepped forward. "Who was it?" Nathaniel swallowed hard. I saw Lady Eleanor sneaking out of Lord Ashford's cabin before the murder." The room erupted into chaos. "That's a lie," Eleanor cried. "You're trying to pin this on me." Graves's mind raced. Eleanor's handkerchief was found in Hargrove's quarters. Her family's dagger was used in the first murder. And now, Nathaniel accused her directly. Was she truly the killer? Or was Nathaniel hiding something far darker? A revelation in blood. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, throwing passengers off balance. Dishes and glasses shattered as the Aurora Express roared through a tunnel. In the chaos, Nathaniel made a break for the door. "Stop him!" Graves shouted. But it was too late. Nathaniel had disappeared into the next carriage. Graves knew at that moment. Nathaniel Cross was not just a witness. He was part of the crime. And if they didn't stop him soon, someone else would die before the train reached its destination. The Aurora Express thundered through the night, its rhythmic clatter echoing the pounding heartbeat of Detective Alaric Graves. Nathaniel Cross had fled. Graves dashed through the dimly lit corridors, weaving between panicked passengers. The train jolted violently as it approached a sharp curve, nearly throwing him off balance. Then, a gunshot rang out. Graves froze. Silence followed, except for the distant howling of the wind. The killer had struck again. The confrontation. Following the sound, Graves reached the rear carriage, a luxurious observation car with wide windows overlooking the endless darkness. Inside, Nathaniel Cross stood near the open door, gripping a revolver. A lifeless body lay at his feet. Sir Reginald Whitmer. Blood pooled beneath him, his eyes staring into nothingness. Nathaniel turned, his face drenched in sweat. "Stay back, Detective." Graves raised his hands cautiously. "So it was you all along." Nathaniel let out a breathless chuckle. "Not quite." His grip on the gun tightened. "I only killed him because he figured it out." The true mastermind. From behind Graves, a soft voice spoke. Nathaniel was just following orders. Graves whirled around, and his stomach twisted. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the carriage, calm, composed, and smiling. Graves' mind raced. The family dagger, the handkerchief in Hargrove's quarters, the stolen cabin key. It was her. Eleanor tilted her head. "Clever detective, you were so close." "Why?" Graves demanded. "Why kill Lord Ashford?" Her eyes darkened. "He ruined my family. Ashford orchestrated my father's financial downfall. He drove him to ruin, to death. He thought he got away with it, but I made sure he paid." "And Hargrove?" Graves pressed. "He wasn't part of this." Eleanor scoffed. "That fool overheard too much. I couldn't take any chances." She stepped closer, eyes locked onto Graves. "Reginald figured it out. That's why I had Nathaniel silence him. And now, there's only one loose end left." The final move. Eleanor raised the revolver. Graves had seconds to react. With a sharp jerk, the train screeched around a curve, and Graves lunged forward. Bang! A shot whizzed past his ear, shattering the glass window. Using the momentum, Graves wrestled the gun from Eleanor's hands and sent her crashing onto the floor. Nathaniel tried to intervene, but Reynolds, the security officer, tackled him from behind. Eleanor gasped for breath. Her wrists now bound in cuffs. She glared at Graves. "Clever detective, but I almost won." Graves exhaled, glancing at the fallen victims. "Justice caught up with you first." The mystery solved. As the Aurora Express slowed toward its final destination, the remaining passengers breathed a sigh of relief. Nathaniel and Eleanor were taken into custody. The horror had ended. But for Detective Graves, the night's events left a lingering question. How many more secrets traveled aboard the Aurora Express? The Aurora Express slowed to a crawl as it entered the station at the journey's end. Its golden lights gleamed like a beacon in the darkness, a symbol of the relief that came with the truth being revealed. But for Detective Alaric Graves, the satisfaction of solving the case felt distant, like a dream fading away. The calm after the storm. Outside, the station was bustling with police officers, reporters, and curious onlookers. Nathaniel Cross and Lady Eleanor Whitmore were taken into custody, their fate sealed. Graves stood by the station platform, gazing at the train that had now brought him both closure and chaos. The passengers who had once looked at him for answers now carried the weight of their own stories. Stories shaped by the darkness hidden within the walls of the train. "Detective?" A familiar voice broke his thoughts. Officer Reynolds approached, a slight nod of respect in his gaze. "You did it, Graves. You solved the case. We'll take it from here." Graves nodded, but his mind lingered on the events that had unfolded. There had been something unnerving about the calm cruelty with which Eleanor had executed her plans. And Nathaniel, he was nothing but a pawn, driven by fear and twisted loyalty. But as the train's steam hissed and faded into the night, Graves knew that the Aurora Express had not just been a place of death. It had been a symbol of something darker. The secrets people were willing to kill for. A quiet reflection. As Graves prepared to leave, he caught one last glance at the train, his thoughts turning inward. There were always more mysteries, more questions, more stories waiting to be uncovered, but for tonight, the mystery had been solved, and that, for now, was enough.